Okay, folks, I think we're going to begin. It's, what time is it? 10:30. So, all right, I'm going to start. Good morning. My name is Michele Sterlace. I am a moderator of this event along with Cecilia Lester. Welcome to an Unsafe Space, episode 1 in a series of conversations with diverse contemporary feminists, presented by Feminists Choosing Life of New York. These symposiums aim to highlight the value of informed, rigorous, civil dialogue from divergent worldviews on divisive pressing issues that affect women everywhere. Today's incredible scholars will discuss female poverty, abortion, equality, and autonomy. Each panelist will present individually for about 10 minutes. Our 4 panelists will then engage in conversation with each other for about 30 minutes regarding their different perspectives, potential mutual interests, and possible ways of moving forward as feminists concerned about these topics, whether pro-life or pro-choice. After this discussion, Cecilia Lester will be taking questions from the audience for our panelists. So please submit your questions starting now, if you'd like, in the question and answer box at the bottom of the screen. The Q&A will last about 20 minutes. I'd like to wholeheartedly thank Grace Neubauer, master's degree graduate of SUNY Brockport, and Gabrielle Landry, a rising junior at Harvard College, for their help organizing this event. I'm now going to introduce our esteemed panelists, and then they will begin. Our first presenting scholar is Robin West. Professor West is the Frederick Haas Professor of Law at Georgetown Law Center, where she teaches American legal theory, law and humanities, law and literature, and related seminars, and directs the Georgetown Fellows Program and the SJD Graduate Program. Professor West has written on various topics in feminist jurisprudence, legal philosophy, law and literature, and constitutional law and theory. Her latest books are The Natural Foundations of Civil Rights from Cambridge Press and Feminist Jurisprudence, a reader from Egler Press, which she co-edited with Cynthia Brown. She lives in Maryland. She has 3 grown kids, 2 grown stepkids, and a very new stepped grandbaby, all of whom she hopes to see sometime soon. Thank you, Professor West, for joining us. Our second presenting scholar is Erika Bachiochi. Erika is a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and a senior fellow at the Abigail Adams Institute in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where she founded and directs the Wollstone Craft Project. Erika received her law degree from Boston University's School of Law and spent a year as a visiting scholar at Harvard Law School. The editor of 2 books, Ms. Bachiochi's scholarly and popular essays have appeared in publications such as the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy, The Atlantic, Politico, CNN, National Affairs, First Things, SCOTUS Blog, and Public Discourse. Her newest book, The Rights of Women, Reclaiming a Lost Vision, is forthcoming from Notre Dame University Press in July. Thank you, Erika, for joining us. Professor Eva Kittay, our third panel scholar, is a distinguished professor emerita. I don't know if I said that word the right way. How do you say that word? Okay. Of philosophy at Stony Brook University, SUNY. She received her PhD in philosophy at the CUNY Graduate Center. Her pioneering work interjects questions of feminism, care, and disability, especially cognitive disability, into philosophy, Her publications include Metaphor, Its Linguistic Structure and Cognitive Force, Love's Labor, Women, Equality and Dependency, several edited volumes and over 100 papers. She was president of the American Philosophical Association, Eastern Division, has received an NEH and Guggenheim Fellowship, the Leibowitz Prize awarded by the Phi Beta Kappa and American Philosophical Association, and her latest book, Learning from My Daughter, The Value of Care of Disabled Minds from Oxford University Press in 2019, was awarded the Prose Prize for the best book in philosophy in 2020. Thank you, Professor Kittay, for joining us. Elizabeth Schiltz is our final presenter. Elizabeth Schiltz, or Lisa, is the John D. Herrick Professor of Law at the University of St. Thomas School of Law in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Professor Schiltz earned a BA from Yale University and a JD from Columbia School of Law. After years in private practice as a banking regulatory lawyer in Washington, D.C. and Minneapolis, she joined the faculty of Notre Dame Law School. 5 years later, she returned to Minneapolis as one of the founding faculty members of St. Thomas Law. She teaches and publishes in the areas of contract, consumer law, and disability law, and has recently established a special education clinic. She serves on the boards of various organizations, one of which includes an international federation of communities of people with and without disabilities living together in friendship. Thank you, Professor Schiltz, for joining us. I want to thank everyone for attending and for participating in this event. And so I'm going to hand it over to Professor West to begin. And so up to you, Professor West.
Thank you, Michele, and thank you for the invitation to participate, and to all of my co-participants and the audience for coming as well. So abortion is typically characterized by both pro-life and pro-choice feminists as a choice. This framing has very different implications for the two sides of the debate. On the pro-life side, since abortion is a choice, it is one which can be deterred and retributed by the criminal law. The chooser is both blameworthy and culpable. On the other side, since the choice to abort a pregnancy is a choice about a personal matter that implicates family, marriage, and an individual's conception of the good life, it is a choice that should be constitutionally protected against legislative infringement. Thus, one side criminalizes the choice while the other constitutionalizes the choice, but they both construe it as a choice. I don't want to challenge that construction. Yes, women do choose to have abortions, but I do want to address some of the costs of that understanding, particularly in legalistic contexts. One such cost I have addressed elsewhere. In a liberal market economy, the consequences of a choice to procure a good or a service, including its costs, like any other, are borne by the chooser. If I choose to abort a pregnancy, I pay the cost, both financial and otherwise, of the abortion. But note, with the availability of abortion, mothering also becomes a matter of choice. Therefore, if I choose not to have an abortion, but rather to carry a pregnancy to term, I'm responsible for the consequences, including the cost of child raising. The rhetorical focus on choice and pro-choice advocacy thus may have the indirect effect of rendering more threadbare our communitarian sense of shared responsibility for the costs of each other's caregiving. I think that is an untoward and unreckoned consequence of the rhetoric of choice that permeates that advocacy, which I have written on elsewhere. What I want to discuss here is that the focus on choice has another blinding effect as well. It may blind pro-life feminists to the moral meaning of the determinants of women's decisions to choose abortion. Let me try to be clear on what I am not talking about. A pregnant woman may choose to obtain an abortion rather than carry the pregnancy to term for any number of reasons, many of which are discussed in pro-life scholarship and advocacy. A woman may choose abortion because she is or believes herself to be too poor to have a baby or another baby, because she has life projects that preclude motherhood, because she's too sick to successfully carry the pregnancy to term, because the pregnancy itself is life endangering, because she does not feel equipped to mother a baby with birth defects, or because she fears or simply does not want the entrapments and constraints of maternity. Pro-life feminists and others have discussed these and other reasons like them, finding some more blameworthy or exonerating than others. The question I want to raise, though, is not why women choose to get abortions. If I choose to have an abortion for any reason at all, it means I have an unwanted pregnancy. The question I wish to raise is why? Why do I have the unwanted pregnancy? It can't be simply that I chose it. We don't typically choose what we don't want. It doesn't make sense to think of the unwanted pregnancy as distinct from the abortion as a choice. Rather, I think we should look at the unwanted pregnancy as a precondition, and in fact, a very strong precondition of the abortion decision. Unwanted pregnancy is the precondition that prompts the necessity of the decision whether to obtain an abortion or to continue with the pregnancy and have what may then become an unwanted birth, followed by unwanted maternity. Shouldn't all of us then, whether or not we morally condemn the choice to have an abortion, also focus on the unwanted pregnancy that is its precondition? Shouldn't we understand pregnancy, in fact, as not only the precondition of the problematic decision to get an abortion, but also simply an extraordinarily problematic condition of too many women's lives, and often of too much of a woman's life, as itself a major contributor to women's poverty, inequality, and lack of autonomy, and therefore as something to worry over, something to minimize, or at least address, rather than focus so relentlessly on the decision to abort. So preliminarily, let me emphasize that one reason we don't do this is the logic of this debate. The focus on constitutionalism on the pro-choice side masks these questions. If the choice is constitutionally protected, it doesn't matter why the chooser chooses as she does, but nor does it matter how the chooser came to the point of having to make a choice. Thus, preconditions, just like reasons, don't matter. The choice should be constitutionally protected from critique regardless. But the focus on criminalization that still undergirds pro-life politics and scholarship also moots these questions. And to repeat, by these questions, I mean not questions about what motivates the choice to get an abortion, which is much discussed on the pro-life side, but rather what brings about the necessity for the choice in the first place, meaning here the unwanted pregnancy, which is not so much. So to see why, look at criminal law more broadly. Jurists and criminal law scholars do sometimes focus on why someone who commits a violent crime might have made that choice to do so. That is, his reasons for choosing to commit a crime of violence are sometimes relevant to legal questions, including, for example, at the punishment stage, the decision whether to mitigate or aggravate punishment. Not so much attention is paid, though, in law. In fact, it's fair to say that no attention is paid to the background determinants that bring a defendant to the point of choosing criminality, conditions which may include an impoverished background, abusive upbringing, and deficient education. Nor is attention paid in doctrinal criminal law scholarship to how we might alleviate these conditions toward the end of addressing criminality. Nevertheless, in spite of law's own blind eye to the preconditions of crime, several generations now of criminologists, sociologists, and forward-thinking policy analysts, including those who are thoroughly repulsed by the choices made by violent criminal offenders, do recognize the existence of these background preconditions and the need to understand them if we're serious about bringing down the crime rate rather than simply punishing people. They do so, furthermore, regardless of the intensity of their moral condemnation of the criminal choices themselves. Pro-life feminists, I believe, should do likewise with respect to the background condition, unwanted pregnancy, that is the precondition of a woman's choice to abort. Anyone who views the decision to obtain an abortion as something akin to murder will feel inclined to some degree to criminalize it, regardless of legal abortion's contribution to women's autonomy and equality. But if we also want to bring down the number of these morally reprehensible acts, then we should understand the background condition that prompts those choices. Just so, and no less than, if we wish to bring down the violent crime rate, we should address its background conditions, even if we continue to believe those choices should be punished. I think it would greatly enhance and invigorate pro-life scholarship, and therefore all feminist scholarship, were it to take this turn. Unwanted pregnancy, by definition, constitutes the precondition of this decision to abort or take a pregnancy to term. There should be more discussion, and I think much more, of the entire phenomenon of unwanted pregnancy, which is, again, the condition of too many women's lives that prompts these decisions. We should understand that condition simply to better understand the conditions of women's lives, both those who do and those who don't seek abortion. But on the level of policy, if we want to bring down the abortion rate, whether or not we think it wise to criminalize those decisions, we need to address the background condition that prompts the choice itself. And for the same reasons that if we want to bring down the crime rate, we should attend to those background conditions likewise. There is one important precedent for looking at the issue this way, as well as a powerful suggestion for why we don't typically do so. In her path-breaking articles from the 1980s, criticizing the privacy rationale of Roe v. Wade, Catherine MacKinnon argued that what causes unwanted pregnancy, again, the precondition, what I'm labeling the pre-decision of the pre-background condition of the decision to abort, what causes unwanted pregnancy is heterosexual intercourse. Why then don't we discuss that intercourse as a cause of the need for legal abortion? Shouldn't we at least somewhat fault the sex rather than the lack of access to abortion as part of the problem? The reason we don't typically fault the sex, MacKinnon argued, for the unwanted pregnancy to which that sex leads, is that culturally, at least since the pro-sex movement of the mid to late 20th century, we tend to give both heterosexuality and the men who want it a pass, so to speak, both politically and morally. Heterosexual sex, according to the sex liberationist understanding of the time, is either always good or always inevitable. It's going to happen, it just is. Therefore, MacKinnon reasoned, what women feel they need to do in sex libertarian societies, since they can't challenge the sex, is ward off one of the unfortunate consequences of all that sex, which is unwanted pregnancy, and one way to do so is by legalizing abortion. But the sex itself that sets the whole ball rolling is beyond reproach. MacKinnon quite famously found this liberationist tendency to whitewash the sex that causes the pregnancies that in turn prompt the decisions to abort profoundly problematic, and she ultimately faulted the pro-choice movement for indirectly facilitating it. Legal abortion takes away, in her pithy formulation, the, quote, only remaining excuse other than the headache for not consenting to unwanted or coerced sex. She found all that unwanted and coerced sex problematic, however, not so much because of either the immorality of the abortions or the servitude of the unwanted maternity to which that sex leads, but rather because she regarded the sex itself as largely coerced. Heterosexual intercourse occurs within a context in which intercourse is mandatory for most women, whether or not the sex is happening at the point of a knife. All of that coerced, forced, and visibly mandatory sex takes a toll on women's liberty and equality. Some of this, I believe, is deeply right, but some of it was misguided and I think limited the traction of her insight. MacKinnon was entirely right, I think, to suggest that the pro-choice community should indeed look at the sex central to heterosexual practice as the cause of the precondition of abortion, rather than focus so relentlessly on the right to abortion. But she was likely wrong to characterize that sex, the sex that is that brings on unwanted pregnancies, as largely or entirely coerced. She was also wrong, in my view, to consider the unwanted pregnancy as simply a noted consequence of wrongful sex, rather than a wrong in itself. So I want to try to quickly correct both. First, I want to describe 4 categories of heterosexual sex rather than just one that lead to unwanted pregnancies. And I want to do so this time not so as to problematize the sex, but rather with an eye toward identifying the cause of unwanted pregnancies that sex causes, and hence the demand for abortion. So first, quite a bit of the heterosexual sex that causes unwanted pregnancy is indeed rape. And if we want to reduce the incidence of unwanted pregnancy, we should focus like a laser on reducing the number of rapes in the world. Second, and I think this is what MacKinnon saw completely correctly, much sex that is legally consensual, sex that is not rape, is nevertheless coerced. And we should therefore likely be focused on the legally consensual, but nevertheless coerced sex, including the unwanted pregnancies and hence the abortions that result. This would mean targeting marital structures worldwide, including traditions supporting early marriage and forced sex within marriage, as well as social pressures that push teenagers into unwanted sex and sexual harassment practices that still persist in homes, workplaces, and schools. If we could address the phenomenon of coerced sex and not confuse it with rape, this would not only free women from a good deal of coerced sex, but would also reduce the rate of unwanted pregnancies they suffer as a consequence, and ultimately the abortion rate. Third, much uncontracepted sex is not non-consensual and not coerced, but is nevertheless not wanted. And as I've argued many times elsewhere, women and girls consent to sex they don't want for all sorts of reasons: to avoid an argument with a boyfriend or husband, to fulfill familial or social expectations because they've decided that lack of desire rather than the unwanted sex is the problem in their relationship, or because they are dependent upon their partner's good graces and perhaps his finances, and so on. I think that sex is profoundly harmful for a number of reasons. Women and girls should not be having sex they don't want. But one reason is that it tends to be uncontracepted sex. If we could reduce the amount of unwanted sex, we'd bring down the number of unwanted pregnancies. But fourth, much of the sex, contra Catherine MacKinnon, that produces unwanted pregnancies is fully wanted by both parties, is not coerced in the slightest, and I want to end with a suggestion about how we might regard that sex. Here, choice does re-enter the picture, but it's not the choice to get an abortion, and nor is it the choice to have sex. Rather, it's the choice to have uncontracepted sex when one does not wish to conceive. That choice, in turn, may reflect ignorance, but it might also sometimes manifest recklessness. If I choose to have consensual, mutually desired, uncontracepted sex, I have recklessly chosen a course of action that might cause a condition, an unwanted pregnancy, which might in turn prompt me to choose a morally problematic path. Birth control today in the US, unlike a century ago, and unlike in much of the world, is widely available and easy to use. That availability, in fact, is credited by the Guttmacher Institute as the reason for the now falling rate of abortions. That decrease in the abortion rate they've shown is not the result of the difficulty of finding or financing an abortion, as might be widely thought, nor is it the result of changing moral attitudes toward abortion. Rather, it's a function of the availability of affordable birth control. If that's right, then the simple path toward addressing the background precondition of the abortion decision and thereby reducing the number of abortions is not only to make birth control available where it currently is not, but also to emphasize through sex education and family interactions that the use of birth control by parties who do not wish to conceive is not only a right, but it is also a duty. Our sex education courses and curricula have not taken that turn from the language of rights to the language of duty. Neither, however, have our debates. I do understand that for some in the pro-life movement, birth control is no more acceptable than abortion. But I also realize that for many in that movement, that is not the case. Both men and women, all of us have a duty owed generally to not be reckless. In the realm of sexuality, it seems to me that implies a duty, and not just a right, to use birth control where birth control is available so as to eliminate or minimize the risk of putting oneself in a condition in which a morally questionable choice is required. It seems to me both pro-life and pro-choice feminists should agree on this. Finally, if we acted on it, it might bring down the abortion rate considerably. Thank you for listening. It was 12 minutes.
Thank you, Professor West. Okay, Erika, if you would begin, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Okay, thank you, Michele, first for your really tireless efforts in organizing this event for the past, I think, year and a half, as you were put off by COVID, of course. I've really been looking forward to our conversation today. So Robin has written and expressed really powerfully, as you've just seen, how constitutionalizing abortion rights has shifted our focus, both legally and culturally, away from addressing the social and sexual imbalances that result in unwanted pregnancies to kind of managing the unwanted pregnancy itself. So she writes, Roe v. Wade legitimates both unwanted sex and the hierarchies of power that generate it. So I fundamentally agree with this critique, but I want to take it a step further. I want to suggest that the putative right to abortion not only legitimates, but exacerbates the reproductive and social imbalances or asymmetries between men and women. And I think this is especially true for women who are poor. So clearly the most basic and consequential asymmetry between men and women is that when they engage in sexual intercourse, it is women and not men who may end up pregnant. A man, of course, can just walk away from an unintentional pregnancy and blithely return to the course of his life. But a now pregnant woman, should she wish to be equally free of the deeply unequal consequence of their union, will need to engage in a life-destroying act. Now, of course, we know that women have sought this kind of freedom from the consequences of reproductive asymmetry through various contraceptive and abortive methods, and infanticide too, throughout the course of human history. So clearly, justice calls for a societal response to reproductive asymmetry. Indeed, I think recognizing this is perhaps what makes one a feminist. But what is relatively new in this age-old situation, this age-old injustice, is the now widespread view, especially among legal academics, that women's equality, indeed our equal citizenship, demands the right to engage or contract with another to engage in the killing of one's own vulnerable and dependent child. Women should be equally free to enjoy sexual and reproductive autonomy, the right to have consequence-free sex like a man, not only so that she might be able to return to her prior life unpregnant, but we're increasingly told so that she might take her equal GDP enhancing place in the marketplace too. So the chief trouble with this view is not only that it locates women's equality in a kind of imitation of male abandonment, or that it accepts as just violence and domination of the stronger over the weaker, or that it defines citizenship as exclusive of those with caregiving responsibilities and so leaves unchallenged liberal theories in which non-wage earning women and their dependents are relegated to the private sphere, or even that it tends to place the needs and logic of the capitalistic market well ahead of the ethic of care that everyone on this panel shares. But none of these injustices, as serious as they are, gets at the really fundamental trouble with a view of equality that depends on abortion rights. Such a view, when it takes hold of a culture, eats away slowly, perhaps, but surely, at that culture's capacity to acknowledge the reproductive asymmetries at the very heart of the sexual relationship between men and women, though they remain there all the same. The abortion right is a kind of privileged response to these asymmetries, works to paper over them. And so we are surprised and shaken as a culture when 50 years into the 1970s feminist movement, the Me Too movement reveals just how frequently men still dominate and or abandon women. If women's rights advocates work to undo the institutionalized male sexual prerogative by legal reforms to marriage and criminal law in the last century, relatively easy abortion access has emboldened the very worst of men to reclaim that prerogative once again. So Catherine McKinnon insightfully suggested in the 1980s that the abortion debate wrongly focuses on who controls reproduction instead of on who controls sex, as Robin just explored. Pro-choicers, she says, assume that the pregnant woman just happens upon the fetus, while conservatives, she suggests, expect wifely submission to the marital duty. But the question of who controls sex was exactly the one that 19th century advocates of voluntary motherhood, better known to us now as the suffragists, focused upon. Indeed, these women fought against forced motherhood using rhetoric very similar to today's pro-choice advocates, but with very different meaning. These women sought control and sovereignty over their own bodies with regard to sex, the right, as Sarah Grimke put it, to decide when a woman shall become a mother, and how often and under what circumstances. In a word, she says, the right to control all preliminaries. Because women like Grimke knew they had no legitimate authority to engage in, as Victoria Woodhull put it, quote, the antenatal murder of undesired children. Woodhull, the first woman to run for president and an outspoken advocate of constitutional equality for women, affirmatively championed the rights of children too, rights that she said begin while yet they remain the fetus. The basic insight of 19th century women's rights advocates was not only that abortion unjustly took the life of a vulnerable and dependent unborn child to whom her mother and father properly owed duties of care, but they also recognized how the availability of abortion tilted the sexual playing field further in the male direction, empowering men to prioritize and even demand sexual intercourse and their own sexual satisfaction, and to ignore the asymmetries of the act. Dr. Alan Guttmacher, then president of Planned Parenthood, put it 100 years later in 1968, abortion on demand relieves the man of all possible responsibility. He simply becomes a coital or sexual animal. Economists in our day have corroborated this reality too. They've shown that by reducing the cost of sex, easy access to abortion induces sexual partners to take more sexual risks, leading in the decades after Roe especially to more unintentional pregnancy, more non-marital births, and more abortion, all of which of course disproportionately impact women, especially those who are poor. But by the same principle, economists tell us that individuals are sensitive to the costs of their sexual activity. So when the costs of sex increase through state restrictions on abortion access, for instance, individuals will tend to engage in less risky sex, which could be more contraceptive or avoiding sexual intercourse, which is a win, it seems to me, for women. In light of the stubborn gender asymmetries in sex, in desire, satisfaction, reproduction, and early caregiving too, the voluntary motherhood movement of the 19th century believed that sexual equality and true reciprocity between men and women would be found when men met women at a high standard of mutual responsibility and care. So these women demanded not abortion, or even contraception, as pro-choice historians of the time well acknowledge, but rather sexual self-restraint through periodic abstinence, a nascent method of pharmaceutical-free family planning that has become far more reliable in our time. And yet these insights of these early women's rights advocates and the men who joined their noble cause were abandoned just at that point in history, when women, thanks to anti-discrimination law and the like, were gaining the kind of influence in both the private and public spheres that could have made this expectation of male sexual integrity culturally normative. So I want to conclude my remarks this morning by calling attention to that upon which I think we all agree. Our society must work toward an authentic reproductive justice rooted in an ethic of care. Indeed, I've learned so much from all of you on this panel about what that entails. But if justice is giving to each his or her due, I'd want to say with the 19th century women's rights advocates that when a man and woman engage in that act that may foreseeably bring into existence a human child, a being who is needy by nature, a being who is their child, then they are responsible for that child's care. We can't act as though, as McKinnon put it, the woman just happened upon the fetus. So it seems to me the very first requirement of a reproductive justice is recognizing some basic truths about, well, reproduction that persist more than 60 years after the release of the birth control pill. First, sex makes babies. Second, women are still the ones whose bodies bear them. And third, when sex makes a baby, or more properly, I suppose, a zygote, embryo, or fetus, the very existence of that child has transformed intimate sexual partners into a mother and a father. And that mother and father now owe their child what all children are due by virtue of the special biological dependency relationship of children upon their parents. Care for that dependency. And it may be that the most caring and indeed heroic thing the parents, or likely at this point just the mother, can do is place the child with adoptive parents, of whom there are tragically far more in our country today awaiting an infant to adopt than there are infants to adopt. Of course, the great responsibility and great privilege of care falls on the pregnant woman first. There's no getting around this most basic reproductive asymmetry. But whereas abortion allows men to definitively escape the duties that come with siring offspring, a truly egalitarian society would hold men to task. Said differently, just as nature has both gifted and burdened women with the capacity to bear children, culture ought to both gift and burden men with the duties that come with begetting them. But for pregnant and childbearing mothers to receive in justice the abundant care and support they need, not only fathers, but society at large must take up their shared duties of care toward both mother and child too. It seems to me we only get here to really affirming and supporting these shared duties of care between men and women and across all of society when the law speaks clearly about the intrinsic dignity of the vulnerable and dependent child to whom this care is first due. For when we legally belittle the moral status of the unborn child, treating this most vulnerable and dependent human being in nearly a half century of Supreme Court case law as potential life, or in academic and popular arguments as something foreign, non-human, or parasitic upon the pregnant woman, we ought not be surprised when our workplaces and other cultural institutions treat dependent human beings that way too. When we dehumanize the unborn child, perhaps in an effort to convince ourselves that we have some absolute right to non-procreative sex, that dehumanization serves to denigrate the state of pregnancy itself, and so to every pregnant woman. But to paraphrase the great pro-life feminist Sidney Callahan, pregnancy is not the growth of cancer or infestation by a biological parasite. It is the rather astonishing but altogether ordinary way each and every human being enters the world. If pregnancy continues to be likened to any other lifestyle choice or medical condition, or worse, a disability in a Hobbesian contest with wombless men, pregnant women will never receive the cultural esteem and support they in justice are due. Their affirmative choice or voluntary consent to continue their pregnancies will be regarded as akin to all other choices in the now hegemonic market frame of reference, a private assumption of a burden that is theirs alone to carry, rather than a human good for which the entire community bears responsibility. And as Eva has so beautifully taught us in her work, it is poor women who are hit the hardest when care work is considered low status work, or work that women are simply supposed to do. There's no question we have a social responsibility to care for and publicly support the work of caregiving by spreading the costs and burdens of that work to the community at large who so clearly benefit from its labors. Indeed, this is why I'm so pleased by current debates on both the left and the right, inspired by Senator Mitt Romney's Family Security Act. And in that plan, which I very much hope will become law, public support for caregiving rightly starts during pregnancy, because that's when the work of caregiving for a dependent and vulnerable child rightly begins. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Bachiochi. Thank you so much. Okay, Professor Kittay, we look forward to hearing your presentation. I do know that you need to unmute your button. Professor Kittay, you should have a mute button. All right, excellent. Thank you.
I'm sorry. I want to start out by saying that much of what both previous speakers have said, I very much agree with. But I took my job here to offer a pro-choice position that we can then rigorously debate. But I am trying to figure out, I've been trying to figure out how to make that argument without engaging in some of the conceptions and conceptualizations of the individual and society that I really do not agree with. So in 1999, I published a book called Love's Labor, Women, Dependency, and Equality. By the way, there's a reissued edition of that. In it, I argued that women could never hope to share the world with men in equality unless the larger political and social order recognized the centrality of inevitable dependency, the dependency of the infant and child, frail old age, and those that arise from illness and disablement. These dependencies, I argued, need not be pernicious, and none of us have escaped being dependent at some time in our life. Furthermore, those who attend to the needs and wants of dependents, the dependency workers or care dependency workers, themselves become dependent on others to attend both their needs and the needs of their dependents. The dependent and person and the relationship to the dependency worker is at the center of all nested dependencies that constitute our society. I have a slide here. Could you put it up for a moment? As you see in this construction, the fully dependent person is the center of any society. And these are lines of support that are owed to this dependent person. Part of this didn't come through, but there's a recycling of this set of obligations and dependencies for those fully dependent persons who then become the taxpayer citizen. You can put the slide away now. The dependency worker has traditionally, as we know, been a woman. As women moved into the labor force, either because they've wished or needed to work, the question has become, so who is to raise the children? We can add who is to take care of grandma and grandpa or a disabled adult child. Women's desire to live more autonomous lives, to be equal to men in the workplace and in all aspects of public life, has brought into public view the structure of dependency and the need to find equitable ways to ensure that those who need care will be cared for without exploiting women's labor to achieve that end. The demand for autonomy and the quest for equality has anchored many arguments for the right to access abortion services, for reproductive freedom has been seen as critical to women's aspirations. In my work then and since, I've called for a feminist ethic of care, which other speakers have talked about, an ethic which regards the meeting of needs of dependents and dependency care workers as prior to all other considerations. For a wealthy country, we do unacceptably poorly in dealing with issues of care. The level of childhood poverty, the poverty of the disabled, the poor care available to the frail elderly, and the lack of health insurance. These are consequences of ignoring or totally privatizing dependency-related concerns. Within an ethic of care, care is a supreme value. It recognizes the relational value of care and the need for care to be supported by the state as well as by other institutions of civil society. So it's within this framework that I want to introduce the issue of abortion. To do so, it will help to start with a more traditional feminist objection to criminalizing abortion. One epitomized by the famous argument by Judith Jarvis Thompson. This argument was meant to address the idea that the fetus is as much of a person as is the pregnant woman, and that the question of abortion comes down to a clash of rights, that of the fetus to a right to life and the pregnant woman's right to privacy. Her argument is based on a traditional liberal view that only autonomous, voluntarily undertaken responsibilities are ethically binding. In the thought experiment, we are asked to imagine that we've been kidnapped and hooked into a machine where our kidneys will function for a famous musician who is on life support. He needs our kidney to survive until a transplant is found. Clearly, the violinist has the same right to life as we do. We are only being required to remain in this condition for a limited time, around 9 months. As we never consented to this arrangement, it becomes clear that we should have no obligation to abide by it, even to save the life of the famous violinist. I love the fact that she includes that it's a violinist and famous, as if that is the most valuable sort of life. Similarly, she argues that women who find, the woman who finds herself pregnant has every right to refuse her body to be used to bring the fetus to term, even if we admit that the fetus is a person and has the same right to life as the woman. This argument has proved persuasive to many, and for its limited purpose, it is a powerful argument. The woman who has an unwanted pregnancy may well feel like someone whose body has been snatched away, much as the person who's kidnapped and hooked to the violinist. But here I think the analogy ends, for it fails to take into consideration the connection many women develop to the being their body is nurturing. Breaking that connection has a different ethical feel, if you like, than detaching yourself from a stranger you have been kidnapped to save. Moreover, if the pregnancy is not terminated, one is in a lifelong relationship that has profound repercussions. And I think that's true even if you put the child up for abortion, but I'll talk about that in a minute. It is quite different than walking away from the violinist. An ethic of care, in contrast, recognizes as valid and binding obligations that are not always voluntarily chosen. We find ourselves in relationships in which we are assigned certain duties and responsibilities, ones that are not chosen but were not coerced. For example, we don't choose our neighbors, but if a neighbor is in distress and we are able to help or call for help, it is surely our responsibility to do so. From an ethic of care, duties that we have to others arise from the fact that another is vulnerable to our actions, because we, and often we alone, are situated to respond to an important need. Therefore, we have an ethical duty to care for a vulnerable person who's dependent on our care. We also have a right to care for a dependent who is specifically vulnerable to our action. Even if we want to extricate ourselves from these obligations, we cannot simply walk away. However, If we can find another reliable party, we can be justified in delegating that responsibility. If we cannot, then we do have a right to walk away if not doing so means that we will incur a great harm to ourselves. Think here of trying to save a drowning person. You are obliged to try to help, find help, but not risk drowning yourself. Even as those who are vulnerable to our actions deserve care, so we too deserve care for ourselves. Care which is directed at one's flourishing is incompatible with coerced dependency work, or dependency work that can only be carried on by incurring great harm to oneself, and hence coerced. When a relationship is not non-voluntary, but also coerced, then any duty I have to care for a vulnerable other is considerably weakened. Not only do I want to be released from caring duties in situations of coercion, I do not even have the option of delegating that care work to another. The most potent example of that is the slave nanny, but not the only one, but it's just the most potent example. It is not unreasonable to conceive of pregnancy as a form of dependency work. I've never done this before, but I'm trying this out here. A wanted dependency is a voluntarily undertaken responsibility, but an unwanted pregnancy is not. That alone in this ethical framework would not excuse the pregnant woman from her obligation to continue to carry that pregnancy. By the second semester, most women come to feel a connection to the fetus, and one who welcomes her pregnancy may well feel a connection as soon as pregnancy begins. It's a sort of proleptic connection, since the party to whom we feel connected has yet an undefined form. That is, it's a projection of one's future relationship to a child one desires. But should a woman not wish to carry the pregnancy to term, whether the pregnancy resulted from unwanted sex or a lapse in a passionate moment or a failure of birth control, then she nevertheless, must she nevertheless maintain this dependency relationship. The dependency work done by the pregnant woman, the care her body provides for the developing embryo or fetus, is different than most insofar as it can never be delegated to another. The being she carries who has no independent existence such that another could step in and provide that care. If there is no exit, then to forbid the woman from severing that relationship is not the same thing as denying that only voluntary associations give rise to obligations. To prohibit her from aborting is effectively then to coerce the woman into maintaining a relationship and continuing the work of dependency care, the dependency work of pregnancy and birth. Such coercion, any coercion, is contrary to what an ethic of care would allow. The coercion weakens any responsibility she has to maintaining that pregnancy, that dependency relationship. If we insist the coercion is temporary and lasts only for the time the fetus is viable outside the woman's body, the labor of birth is itself a form of dependency work, and that too would be coercion if the woman was unwilling. What if we were to say that, as in the case of Thompson's thought experiment, the woman can just walk away after enduring a relatively short period of coerced dependency care? We can then ignore the fledgling relationship that starts with the awareness of pregnancy, but which grows stronger as the fetus matures. Now we have not only coerced the woman into continuing the pregnancy and giving birth, we disregard the pain of severing what most of the time is a potent felt relationship. If we do so, then we pile cruelty on top of coercion. What if we say, given the relationship that develops toward the fetus, once the child is born, the woman will likely willingly assume the care of the child. This dependency relationship is a lifelong commitment, which, unless the mother and child are in very favorable circumstances, is made more burdensome because we live in a society that offers so little support to mothers and children. The mother's aspirations or ambitions for her own flourishing and what she would have wanted for her child are too often curtailed. Surely, where more support be given to mothers in the form, for example, of a child allowance, having a child from an unwanted pregnancy would be less burdensome. Often the desire to terminate a pregnancy comes from the desire and the need to do dependency work responsibly, not to shirk responsibility, but to dutifully fulfill those one already has. If the argument for access to safe and legal abortion is made on the basis of dependency care, it also follows that the right to do the work of dependency care that is meaningful to oneself is as important as the right to abortion. Injustice is as acute when poverty or racism curtails a woman's ability to bear or raise a child. Access to abortion is, as Robin West has said, not a singular right, but must be part of a larger effort to give women control over their reproductive lives. It starts with uncoerced sex. It includes supporting the work of dependency care by providing resources for the dependency worker and the dependent alike. That's it. I do want to say that, well, I'll leave those remarks for the end.
Thank you, Professor Kittay. Thank you so very much. Okay, Professor Schiltz, looking forward to hearing your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, and I want to join all of my panelists in thanking everybody on the panel for participating in this and the organizers for bringing us all together. I'm joining you all from my home in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I'm sure everybody is aware of the fact that that's where on May 25th of last year, George Floyd was killed. That and similar tragic deaths, all in the midst of this COVID lockdown situation, have just turned our world upside down. And it's hard for me to remember who I was really, you know, a year ago when we had originally planned to have this in-person meeting. The world has changed so much. The aftermath of the killing of George Floyd, and the reason that I'm bringing it up is because it's exposed the reality that many of our social problems are deeply rooted in social structures, deeply entrenched structures that shape and color our perceptions in powerful and subtle ways. And one of the flawed structures that has been dramatically exposed during the pandemic is our support for the work of caregiving. The implosion of our workplaces and schools into our private homes has blurred those lines between those seemingly separate spheres of work and life and turned the notion of work-life balance into a sad joke. The massively disproportionate effect on women of the economic disruptions of the pandemic are so glaring that people are calling it a she-cession. To quote Emily Marin of the National Women's Law Center, COVID set off a bomb in the middle of these jerry-rigged ways of getting by in this country that individual families have created. The light from that bomb blast is shining a glaring spotlight on the gaps in the social structures that we have established to support caregivers who are predominantly women. We continue to rely on the employment market as the only real structural support for caregiving work. That this structure is utterly inadequate for supporting care work, even in the best of times, is something that all of us agree on. But the devastating effect of the collapse of even that feeble structure that we're now experiencing is making it obvious that what we need is, in Eva's beautiful words, a public ethic of care by which we acknowledge the social responsibility to care for the caregiver. All four of us agree on that. But what I'm going to propose now is something that we do not all agree on, but that I hope might help us have a decent conversation. I'm increasingly convinced that one of the entrenched structural flaws is how we have come to organize our paths to equality and autonomy for women around the availability of abortion. Let me explain how I came to this conclusion and how I think this past year has exposed this in startling ways. We all know, right, because of the work of people on this panel and people like Joan Williams, that employment in the U.S. is structured around to accommodate the ideal worker, a person with no obligations for caring for for anybody else, with the ability to devote themselves fully and totally to the demands of their jobs. This obviously disadvantages women economically, psychologically, spiritually, because it devalues the work of caregiving that's predominantly done by women. Julie Suck published an article in the Columbia Law Review in 2010 called "Are Gender Stereotypes Bad for Women? Rethinking Anti-Discrimination Law and Work-Family Conflict." She contrasts the US's pathetically feeble family leave with that offered in most of the other countries in the world. We all know, right, that the US is one of the handful of countries in the entire globe that doesn't offer any federally mandated paid paternity leave. There are a handful of states that offer some. In contrast, countries like France and Sweden guarantee months of paid maternity and paternity leave with robust job protections. Suk analyzes the different commitments of feminist theory that led to the generosity in France and Sweden, but make it impossible for laws mandating any paid maternity leave to get anywhere near enactment in the US, despite decades of efforts. Suk explains that in Europe, the issue of maternity leave was historically considered entirely separately from the issue of sick or disability leave. In those countries, a legal scheme evolved that considered childbirth to be something unique, not a disability, not an illness, and an endeavor in which the women who were primarily affected by it deserved the support of the entire social network. Maternity or paternity benefits are not the responsibility of the employer, they're the responsibility of the state, provided in recognition of the social value of care work. In contrast, in the United States, the issue of maternity leave has always been inseparably intertwined with employment law. Suk points out that the trajectory of the American approach was shaped primarily by feminists in the 60s and in the 70s, who argued for equality based on sameness. They worried that distinguishing between childbirth and any other medical condition by requiring employers to offer maternity benefits would perpetuate negative stereotypes about women's ability to work and result in discrimination against women. Suk argues that family leave should be disaggregated from medical leave, and she also argues that gender stereotypes are not necessarily bad for women. She writes, "The American stereotyping approach attempts to give women the same chance as men to prove their mettle, but fails miserably by ignoring the gendered barriers to their ability to do so." And there's the problem, I think. And there's where abortion finds itself embedded in the structures of employment. Suk explains that the American approach attempts to give women the same chance as men to prove their mettle. If women can become like men, they have an equal chance to succeed. And the single most important protection for women's equality has come to be seen as abortion, which is women's ultimate way to become just like men. Abortion has become embedded into the institutional structure of employment in this country. It has come to be seen as the non-negotiable feature of the social and legal support that women need to succeed in the workplace, to achieve equality and autonomy, to escape poverty. The right to abortion, to escape the responsibility of caregiving, has been prioritized over the right to care for children or the elderly or people who are ill or with disabilities without suffering severe economic penalty. The fight for the right of women to become more like ideal male workers has been prioritized over the fight to restructure the workplace to accommodate caregiving, or to institute social supports for caregivers outside of the structures of the workplace. It has been almost 50 years since Roe v. Wade was decided. Since then, the only form of federal support we've gotten for caregiving is the Family and Medical Leave Act, which gives job protection and 6 weeks of unpaid leave for family and other medical reasons. The pandemic economic collapse has shown what a pathetic job that does in protecting women. A July survey found that U.S. moms were twice as likely as dads to leave their work in 2020. The Bureau of Labor Statistics found 4 times more women than men dropped out of the workforce in September alone. Women's employment rates in the U.S. are currently at the lowest they have been since the end of World War II. Women who leave the workplace even just for a year suffer financial consequences for the rest of their lives. Female poverty is going to increase long-term because of this massive exodus from the workforce. Every single analysis of the reason for this exodus of women that I've been able to identify has been the disproportionate caregiving demands on women as the major factor. The coronavirus shutdowns have closed schools and daycare centers around the country, keeping kids at home and making it even harder for parents, especially the women who are providing the majority of the care, to keep working. For the lowest paid women, the closure of the biggest source of free public childcare, schools, has been devastating. The dangers of COVID-19 eliminated many of the most other common sources of free or low-cost childcare, help from neighbors or family or grandparents. The same issue has bedeviled those caring for the disabled and the elderly. Again, mostly women. Day centers and supported employment programs for the disabled and day centers for the elderly have also shut down. Their caregivers have had to cobble together care too, often at the expense of their paid jobs. It's not lack of access to abortion that's been responsible for this crisis. It's lack of support for caregiving. But what have we done about this? What's our response been to this truly devastating situation? Last year's CARES Act. We got 2 weeks of paid sick leave if an employee is quarantined or has COVID themselves. Then 2 weeks of paid sick leave at 2/3 pay if a person has to care for someone with COVID, and up to 12 weeks if a school is closed. Sounds good, but it's COVID related, not based on any social valuation of care, and it disappears at the end of 2020 with a little bit of an extension for employers to get a tax break if they continue voluntarily to offer it until September. What about the American Rescue Plan? We got this 1-year increase in the tax credit for children, more than $40 billion for supporting childcare providers. All good, but 1 year, one-time subsidies. In the meantime, no movement on the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, which is a bill that was first introduced in Congress in 2012 and has been reintroduced every year, that would simply require employers to make reasonable accommodations to for workers affected by limitations related to pregnancy or childbirth. It's been 50 years since Roe. Abortion's widely available to women, yet in the face of devastating female employment outcomes tied to caregiving, there's been no movement toward a recognition of the social responsibility to care for the caregiver in the broader contexts in which caregiving is crucial to our society, not just for our children, but for the elderly, the sick, and the disabled. So how are women reacting to what they're seeing and experiencing over this year? The Brookings Institute is predicting 300,000 fewer births than usual this year. So women are protecting themselves by retaining the flexibility to mold themselves into ideal workers that our workplace structures demand. So they're choosing the same result that access to abortion gives them because it's the only rational option really available to them, faced with institutional structures of our workplace that simply will not bend, will not yield to the demands of caregiving, and faced with a lack of any social support for caregiving outside of the workplace. Women should not be forced to rely on abortion as a release valve for society's devaluation of the work of caring for others. We need much more radical sorts of changes, like the ones suggested by Eva way back in 2001. Pay for the work of caregivers, maybe through something like Mitt Romney's proposed Family Security Act. Provide visiting nurses to help new mothers, as well as any caregiver who's new to the responsibility of caring for the elderly or the ill or the disabled. De-gendering and de-racing care work through efforts like establishing a care corps. This was Eva's idea too, like the Peace Corps, in which young people spend part of their youth in care work. My hope is that all feminists can agree on that without having to resolve all of our differences on abortion. If we can work together to fight for initiatives like this, we will achieve equality, autonomy, and economic power for women. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Schiltz. Thank you so much. Okay, so now I would ask all the panelists to unmute themselves and have a conversation, please.
Are you going to call on people, Michele, or do you want us to just jump in?
I was hoping y'all would jump in, and at the end of your conversation, we'll have some Q&A. But you have about 15 minutes to have a conversation that you all can, I'm hoping, manage. So thank you, Professor West.
Well, I'm happy to start. It does seem to me that both Lisa and Erika are making a very large bet here. And that is that by reversing course on the legality of abortion more than we already have, perhaps, that will induce society to invest more in caregiving work, to support caregivers, to impel men to pick up a more egalitarian burden of the work within the home, and to compel employers to provide more generous care leave, and so on. Many, many things follow if you put these two talks together, from the from reversing course on the legalization of abortion. So let me just introduce some reasons to be skeptical of that. Eva, of course, focused on the moral obligation of someone who has been coerced into caregiving labor, rather than someone who has chosen caregiving labor. It doesn't always release one, but it may if there's no opportunity to delegate, and that all sounds right. I also just think, though, that it's that as I put it originally, it's a very, very big bet. It seems to me that coercing the work of pregnancy is the logical foundation for coercing the work of caregiving across the board. I mean, look, caregiving in the home is what releases the state from an obligation to do anything about it. States don't do much to support caregiving because they still have worked in assumption that it's women's work. And so as long as you have a breadwinning man and a caregiving woman, you've got social stability. Well, what makes it possible for all of us for so many decades, centuries, to consider the woman who's not compensated for that work as the proper person to engage in that work? It's that virtually in very traditional societies, everything that woman does is coerced. And that everything that woman does that's coerced certainly begins with coercive pregnancy, often from the age of very early teenage years. So there's coerced marriage, followed by coerced pregnancy, followed by coerced labor, followed by, you bet, coerced motherhood. And so insisting on coercing pregnancies all the way through to childbirth and beyond as a way to trigger a more morally responsible set of policies from the state regarding supporting caregivers in the home and supporting employers who provide for caregiving of their employees and for requiring employers to provide for caregiving, the caregiving work of their employees, et cetera, seems to fly in the face of that history. And it flies so clearly in the face of that it's frankly hard for me to get my head around it. And so while I completely appreciate the critique of the choice model of abortion rights, and I think Eva does too, and I know many others who do on the pro-choice, on the so-called pro-choice side, right? And with a strong preference for a caregiving approach to abortion and justification of abortion, but nevertheless, it picks up on the insight first articulated in that early defense of abortion by Judith Thompson, I think is the sensible way to go. And then the shared work, I think, is just minimizing the need to make this decision. And I think that I fully agree with Erika now that the work of minimizing the need to make that decision really should begin with understanding the unequal power of men and women, particularly in the realm of sexuality. I think Catherine McKinnon had that exactly right. But I don't think that what follows from that insight is this large utopian notion. I'm all for utopian visions, by the way, but I don't think what follows is this understanding that this utopian vision of caregiving equally shared and societally supported is what will come on the heels of reversing policy on the legalization of on the legality of abortion, which is, as Eva emphasized, a pretty limited right to begin with.
Do you want me, Lisa? Do you have something to say, or should I?
I'll just say one quick thing. I'll just say one quick thing, which is that I'm all for enforcing. I don't have this vision that there would be this, that we would make abortion illegal and then all of a sudden everybody would jump in and share. I think there needs to be coercion for the social evaluation of the care work, and that I think if that came first, right? It would go a long way to minimizing the need for abortion. And then my hope would be eventually people would be, freer to consider whether they want to continue to have everything hinge on women choosing to have abortions. So I have no vision that abortion becomes illegal and then magically, it's all fairy dust and everybody becomes really, really good and just. I think it's the other way around. I think we have to impose on everyone, on workers and on ourselves as taxpayers, the obligation to support caregiving first. But anyway, that's all I wanted to say.
Yeah.
And then Eva, I completely agree with one part of what you said, which is that providing more egalitarianism and more equality on the caregiving side may well reduce the demand for abortion and so on, because it makes motherhood more attractive. No question about that. The question is whether or not you get there through reversing course on legal abortion.
But I also want to put in a caveat here. And it's also a caveat about focusing on the sex that comes before abortion, before the pregnancy. I think you're really right, Robin and Erika, to insist that that's a moment we have to look at and pay attention to. But we also have to be aware that the reason women who have wanted to advocate for access to abortion have not wanted to go in that direction is because the traditional conservative response is sex could only be productive sex, procreative sex, and it should happen within a marriage. And it has to happen between two heterosexuals. And those are all structures that I think that most feminists, if not all feminists, want to avoid. They don't want to see. So it's very difficult to make the point that you want to focus on the preconditions of that unwanted pregnancy. It has to start that if one thinks about the issue in terms of reproductive freedom, reproductive justice, and I think we have women of color to thank for bringing that point to light, because many women of color have said, right to abortion. I just don't want to get sterilized. I want to be able to afford having a child. I don't want to have to spend all my time working. I want to spend time with my children. So that we need to, and I think this is a place where we really can agree that what we're looking for is a wider view on what reproductive freedom means. And that starts with sex that is not a violation of a woman. I use the word violation rather than violence. Linda Alcoff talks about it this way, that there are many kinds of violations that occur even where there's no violence. And end with truly well-supported care work. It has to be taken all together. Yes.
So I'm going to jump in and first, I don't think, Eva, I've said to you in person, but I wrote a piece on Love's Labor that I think it's just such a really incredibly beautiful book that I've learned so much from. So I guess what I would say in response is, I think I take a little bit of a different view maybe than Lisa, that I think that there's a way, I think we all would agree that that the law teaches, right? And so I think without understanding who it is that we're talking about, so we know that in constitutional law that until I think Justice Kennedy, in a recent case talked about the unborn child as an unborn child and the mother as a mother, that we've been kind of, there's just been this onslaught of understanding of potential life. And it's still something that, I mean, this is something in the 19th century when the science was advanced that everyone at that point knew who we were talking about, that the unborn child was an unborn child. And I appreciate that both of you and someone like Judith Jarvis Thompson gets that. Unfortunately, that's not how our society thinks about it. And there's a lot of euphemisms around this, where we aren't actually talking about the vulnerability and dependency of who exists, that there is an actual human being who is incredibly vulnerable and entirely dependent. And so I think it's important that the law recognize that, but as it does, the killing of any human being, which is that such an act of killing would be unlawful because it's the taking of innocent life. That's a very different kind of situation. And so I tend to like John Hart Eli's The Wages of Crying Wolf still as the best response to Roe, which he wrote like that, he scribbled, right that year, and I guess in the Yale Law Journal, where what Roe did was take, states' authority away from the state to prevent, unlawful killing of an innocent life without, kind of discussing the proportionate reasons that we might, do so. So I think when you guys have both talked about criminalizing abortion, I think that it's better to think about it as, it's an unlawful act to take the life of a, vulnerable, innocent human being. But then there could be exceptions because of proportionate sort of exceptions for proportionate kind of reasons, in terms of self-defense or something like that, where then you're it's still, you don't talk about then, abortion as a right, which I just can't conceive that it ever could be understood that way when, especially in your work, Eva, that we have duties to our children, not a right to take a life, but that there might be exceptions in the law which can cancel kind of punishable behavior because of, mitigating circumstances and all the things, Robin, you talked about. And that's certainly how the early women's rights advocates thought about it. I mean, they were very much with, the doctors wanting to make laws against abortion, but then they didn't like the way the doctors were talking about the women involved in abortion, because they understood this as, even if you set up these laws, there's still the problem of women in horrible situations. And so you need to actually, deal with that. And that's what, we're all talking about in terms of supporting care work and all these other things. The other problem though, and I mean, this is just to kind of rehearse what I've already said, but is that when you have, obviously we now have sort of very different law and in all different states. At this point, it's, almost as if Roe is sort of being things are sort of returning back to the states without overturning Roe if these laws are allowed to stand in the more red states. But I think I'm losing my train of thought of what I was going to say. Oh, right. But that when you have really easy access to abortion, like in New York, where, feminist choosing life is, there are ways in which that abortion, that easy access to abortion, does induce the kinds of sexual risk taking that are very bad for women. And so to me, it seems like when you ease up, so I would want to see both these things happen at the same time. Absolutely support for caregiving. Absolutely all the things that we've talked about. Come on, like get with it. I mean, how to assume that that women just kind of take on this care and no one seems to understand how important and fundamental the work of care and of both mothers and fathers in the home is, to economic, political, and social civic life is kind of ridiculous, right? But then to sort of understand that the law speaks a message about who it is to whom we owe this care. And then I guess just a final word about this, your argument, Eva, about coercion, is that I think one of the things that you said is that a woman comes to feel an attachment to her child after some time, or may come to feel that attachment, and that if she offers that child for adoption, that sort of that attachment is like ripped from her, and that's a serious matter, right? And it's something that I think a lot of women fear, and so then they have the abortion instead, and we hear that anecdotally, and in sort of the research and the data that we see. But I think what I think I would just want to say, I mean, again, kind of calling upon your own work, is that there's an actual, it's not just a subjective attachment, there's an actual objective dependency relationship, an objective existential dependency relationship. And it's not as though it's just a neighbor calling for help. I created through my own act with, you know, in my case, with a man, a being who is needy by nature. And I knew that this could happen, you know, if I understand what sex is and the, you know, fallibility of contraception, if that's what I'm doing or whatever. And so it's not just that, you know, so I have a responsibility to that child because I've created a being who is needy by nature. So it's not that I'm a neighbor asking, you know, or I see someone, you know, in a pool of water, and yes, I have a duty to go get them if it doesn't harm me, but I've actually pushed that child into, you know, I pushed someone to the pool of water. I've created that neediness. And so I have a duty to go and you know, I'm obligated in that way then to care for that child, even if no one can step in. It seems to me that I have a special responsibility as a mother, and then that responsibility certainly moves on to the father, whether or not he's in you know, the situation. I think Robin has written great things, and also Sherry Montroe. Actually, just in case you don't know, Utah has basically a preglimony statute that's sitting on the governor's desk, which is basically saying that men should be responsible for 50% of costs incurred by pregnancy if no one else can take it up, like a workplace. I don't know why it's only 50%. It seems to me that it should be a lot more, since obviously the woman is carrying the child, and those are the kind of costs and burdens she's taking on. But I guess those would be my responses.
And in the interest of time, I'm hoping that either Professor West or Professor Kittay will give a brief response, and then we'll have just about 10 minutes for some audience question and answer. Please, Professor West.
How about if we both give very brief responses?
Sounds great.
Okay, I think that, as I said at the beginning, that the insight or the descriptive claim that that abortion is akin to murder is going to dictate an impulse toward criminality, even if it's recognized that abortion promotes the equality and the liberty of women, and that criminality will be viewed as trumping any argument that rests on equality or liberty. That's why I do think it's important to think through what we should do about the precondition, about the unwanted pregnancies, right? Even if you continue to believe that the abortion is a murderous decision, one might then think that one should be concerned about what it is that prompts those decisions, and what prompts those decisions is the state of unwanted pregnancy. So I'm glad that we've had as much discussion as we've had, and I think we should have much more about what that state of unwanted pregnancy entails. And on the caregiving, again, I just want to restate that that mandatory caregiving by women is so firmly grounded in these certitudes and magnitudes of the physical caregiving of women for the fetus or for the unborn child. That's the image, I think, that carries over into the rest of life, right? Women do this caregiving, it's mandatory, it's just in the nature of things. And so it doesn't seem so troubling that women do all the rest of it as well. So I just think the causal arrow there goes the other way.
I also want to make one brief comment, and that is the reason I haven't talked about pregnancy as dependency work before is because I am not willing to call the unborn being a child. The unborn being is still, because of its utter dependency, it's an utter dependency on one single woman's body. It's not an independent being, as yes, not that any of us are independent beings, but it's relatively speaking, an independent being that should have that kind of claim on a woman's body and life, if that is not just not chosen. I mean, not chosen is not the measure for whether or not you have ethical obligations, but it can be non-chosen and non-coerced, or it can be non-chosen and then coerced because there's no exit opened. So I think this is a real difference, and this is why I've been so hesitant in talking about pregnancy as dependency work.
Thank you, Professor
want to
Kittay.
try.
Thank you so much. I'm going to hand it over to Cecilia Lester Hayes, and she'll ask the panelists questions from the audience. Thank you, Cecilia.
Oh, thank you, Michele. And thank you to all of our panelists. It's been a great discussion. We've gotten a lot of great questions, so I'm just going to jump right in. The first question is, what can be done to stop sexual coercion and forced participation in unwanted sex that may, as Dr. West rightly says, end in unwanted pregnancy?
I'm not a doctor, but at any rate,
Sorry, that's in the question.
Okay. So what can be done? Well, I mean, it depends on the society you're talking about. It depends on the context, on how much societal resources put into this project. But I think minimally, we could say in relatively privileged countries like this one, take it on as our duty as parents to teach our children and ourselves that it's not only, when you have sex with somebody, you should not only be required to make sure they're consenting, which is a minimum. Yeah, you should be sure they're consenting. If you don't do that, it might be rape. You should be required morally to make sure that both parties want it, right? And for many people, that means making sure you yourself want it, which can be a burden, but for everybody, it means making sure the other party wants it. And I think just that change, the change in our sense of what we do when we do sex education. I mean, I looked at a bunch of sex education programs. They're all emphasizing consent, right? We emphasize consent in law to distinguish rape from non-rape. We emphasize consent and, you know, distinguishes slavery from labor. It distinguishes all sorts of things. Consent has this kind of magical quality. And I think that here, as in other areas of life too, frankly, consent should be regarded as necessary and not sufficient. And here, most clearly, it should be regarded as necessary but not sufficient. So, so easing up on, I mean, if you could reduce unwanted sex simply by emphasizing that obligation, that duty, that sex should be mutually desired before it proceeds is one thing. And then on the coercive side, that requires more than just simple education, right? The thinking through deeply what it is about various societal structures in whatever society you're talking about that tends to regard women's reproductive labor and women's sexual labor as something that is mandatorily handed over is a major project. I just want to emphasize that that's different from the work of minimizing rape.
I would just want to add, I think it's, you know, I would say, and I suspect Robin disagrees with me on this, but I think it's not only, you know, that we teach our children, you know, that sex should be desired by both parties, but that we should also teach our children that there's a disproportionate burden of sex on women. And so that it's not, so that we have to understand really what sex is, and that there's a capacity that sex can make a child, even if there's contraception that's being used because of user and failure rates. And so I think that we get, you know, contraception, and it gives us this kind of false confidence that acts will be definitively sterile, and that's just not the case. And so we have to understand what sex is and the disproportionate burdens potentially on a woman, whether or not she chooses to have an abortion or not. It seems to me that, you know, she's the one who ends up pregnant. And so this idea of kind of, you know, that women, you know, for all time have been assumed to be the caregivers, to me, I mean, it kind of, it buys into the idea that like the male is the normative, that the non-caring party is the normative, when it seems to me that the, you know, the mother-child bond is, and the sort of maternal person should be the normative, like the caregiving person should be the normative. And so the fact that women are obligated for all time to care, that's because all human beings should be obligated for all time to care. So I just think the idea of like we can walk away from caregiving and, you know, women can never do that. Well, men shouldn't be able to do that either. And I think that's really the problem, is that we still are stuck in kind of male norm, like the male body is the norm, the unpregnant body is the norm, when it seems to me that it's that which is emblematic, like pregnancy is emblematic of that which, you know, we should all be taking on, and that you know, the state should be understanding those kinds of and supporting those kinds of obligations, interweaving obligations we all have toward one another.
But you don't want the caregiving slave to be what's emblematic and what's normative, right?
Right.
I mean, there is a big difference between a caregiving slave, someone who is enslaved into caregiving, and someone who is caregiving because of the various virtues and the various benefits. That's my first response. The second, though, Oh my God, it's whatever you said first. Now.
Should we have more questions? Sorry, I see that there are 36 of them.
Yeah, there's failure rates, but be realistic, okay? The failure rates of reliable birth control are dropping profoundly, and that is what's driving the drop in the demand for abortion. So whether you think abortion is murder or not, no one thinks it's a good thing. It's very good to have a world in which women don't ever need abortions, in which there's no demand for abortion. The way to get there, it seems to me, is to have responsible social policies, both on the caregiving side, of course, but also on the birth control side, for people who are not coerced into sex, not having unwanted sex, for people who want a healthy sexual relationship and want it to be a heterosexual one, and who don't wish to conceive.
Okay, can you all comment on the Equality Act and what your position is on that, if you think it's going to help or hinder women? We'll start with Eva or Lisa, actually. That'd be great.
I don't really know enough about it to comment in this context.
I don't know. Yeah.
Or Robin?
I'd say the same.
I put it through, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I've written about this, and you can go find my article in America Magazine about what the kind of harms I think that it would do to women's sports and, you know, female-only spaces to allow trans-identifying men to, you know, refer to themselves and be considered as women. I mean, it's the kind of work that, you know, women have been working for decades, to be able to have our own sports, play on our own sports teams, and not, you know, have men take away titles because they've been in a male body with all the hormones, testosterone shooting through it for its whole life. So yeah, I mean, I think that would be my first thing. And then I've also written about the abortion and kind of equality aspects of it in America, if you want to check that out.
I really don't think that women's sports is challenged by trans women, but I don't want to say anything beyond that. I really haven't thought it through very carefully. I just don't think that that's a worry that we need to spend too much time on.
Okay, well, I'll move on then. Sounds good. Abortion and contraception have been widely available for decades. Has abortion, or more generally, limiting unwanted pregnancy, been effective in alleviating the background preconditions that make life so materially difficult for impoverished women? Maybe Lisa, could we start with you?
Yeah, I think the answer to that is no. I think that's part of the argument that I'm trying to make too. I mean, it hasn't materially changed. I think the reality of the fact that women's advancement, economic security, children's economic security is so disproportionately disfavored in the way that we organize our workplaces, and the way that we organize our views of what it is that people ought to be doing with their lives. I think the answer is no.
Well, I think
I want to. Okay. I'm not sure how if we don't just take abortion, but we take abortion, contraception, various means by which women can get control over their reproductive lives. That may not have eliminated female poverty and child poverty. It hasn't. Those sorts of things need much broader structural approaches.
Yep.
But it's hard for me to see how women could be in the kinds of positions they are in now if they would not have that control over their reproduction. And I think it's not a coincidence that women's liberation, if you will, began with the introduction of contraception. I think the need for abortion is a drop back. I agree. I don't think most feminists want to have a world in which we have more abortions. We want to have a world in which there are very few abortions. And I think it's unfortunate that so much of the discussion in feminism started around the issue of abortion. It did, I think, very much for the reasons that Lisa has said. The emphasis on the autonomous, equal individual that started here, which is different than how feminist movements started elsewhere. But I can't imagine a world without contraception and the fallback for abortion, where women would do, on the whole, as well as they have. And there's been a tremendous change.
Yeah, and there's a tremendous amount of research that supports that. I mean, addressing female poverty globally has been the major product of the family planning movement, and I think that the causal line there is just very.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know that that's. I think that there's certainly evidence with regard to the pill and helping wealthier women. But there's, I mean, even Sarah McClanahan at Princeton shows that there's the sexual revolution has had really unequal sort of benefits maybe to richer and wealthier, elite women, and then not so great benefit, not so more burdens for poor women because of the way in which, sort of the abortion-backed contraceptive revolution, decoupled sex from marriage. And I think, Eva, you mentioned that maybe all feminists wouldn't be all for marriage, but you see in like Isabel Sahil's work and Sarah McClanahan and lots of people on the left now are, showing how, marriage is the way in which, or single motherhood is really, the chief cause of poverty. And so as much as you give more and more money in our sort of anti-poverty kinds of programs, which I very much, believe in, you're kind of doing a disservice to the poor as, you don't kind of think about marriage and valorize marriage the way that elite women do. So elite women are still getting married at the same rates as they were in the 50s. Amazingly, they're the highest demographic group getting married because they understand that you need to have, the child's father around in order to care for that child well, but then also in order to, to have support for yourself in doing the kinds of work, whether it's care work or professional work outside the home, that you can. And so it's really, the fact that there's so little marriage and even cohabitation just doesn't last that long in our country for sure. And so that's the kind of thing that's adding to poverty, is these unequal lives in terms of the way in which the unmarried poor are doing far worse, partly because of lack of the stability that marriage brings in their own lives and the lives of, and that it's a wealth producing institution and all these kinds of things. And there's obviously lots of other problems that are causing poverty for sure. But I think
there are two things that I want to say in response to that. First of all, Sweden has solo mothering than we do, far more. There's much less marriage in Sweden. There's also a hell of a lot less poverty, and being a solo mom in Sweden does not condemn you to poverty. So within the society we have, it's true, but that's the structures that we want to challenge. There was another point I want to make about but yeah, I think the two things go together because of the larger structure. Oh, I know. The thing about richer women, more elite women marrying at higher rates, it's always been the case that impoverished populations marry at a lesser rate because the men have less access to wealth. When a elite woman marries, she has access to a man who is able to support the child, who's able to support her. But without that, why bother getting married? If the men for whom within your class that you would be likely to marry can't provide that financial security anyway. It doesn't feel like there's much advantage to marrying. So which way the causality goes, I mean, there's certainly a correlation, but which way the causality goes, I think is not at all clear.
Hey,
I would like to just say too that I think the gendered nature of the consequences of the pandemic is going to provide further evidence. Like, we don't keep having to go back to history, but we're going to be seeing over the next year, right, that it hasn't, that abortion isn't really helping when push comes to shove, and when the structures, the little structures that we put together to kind of empower women to continue to advance and make a living in the world, when they're collapsing like they are right now, and when the consequences to women is the caregivers, which are mostly women, is being seen as dramatically as it's being seen this year. In the next couple of years, we're gonna see playing out evidence that abortion hasn't been helping the cause of getting women out of poverty.
Let me just say really quickly, I think that anyone who thinks abortion was going to get women out of poverty were delusional to start with. Abortion doesn't get women out of poverty. And it shouldn't be regarded as a cure for poverty. It's family planning and contraception, though, go a long way toward getting women out of poverty. And so, yes, decoupling sex with responsibility, Erika, I don't know about marriage, but decoupling sex with responsibility may carry some blame here. It's nothing, though, compared to the rendering of family planning and contraception services to poor women as a cause of their further impoverishment. And I think that, I just think that the case for that is really clear. By conflating abortion and contraception all as abortion, yes, it makes it look almost ridiculous to claim that this is helping. Abortion isn't going to have those consequences, those positive consequences for lifting women out of poverty. It's the entire array of women's reproductive health and tending to it, including contraception services and abortion where needed. I do think that the fewer abortions, the better, all things else being equal. All things are not equal, but generally. And if we could do more for contraception services and family planning services to pick up and to have a more robust role in responding to the reality of women's lives, that you would see even more of a dramatic decrease in not just female impoverishment, but the impoverishment of families.
Thank you, Professor West. All right, folks, we're only 12 minutes over, so that's not too bad. I know I learned so much. I'm just going to end this conversation by saying, thanks wholeheartedly to everyone for joining us. FCLNY hopes to see you all again at episode 2 of An Unsafe Space, Conversations Among Diverse Feminists on Phenomena Affecting Women Everywhere. There's so much to talk about. I know I learned so much, and just thank you all again. Thank you very much.
No.
Thank you. It's a privilege. It was a privilege.
It's been enlightening, I think, certainly for me as well. I think it's been very, very productive.
And it's just so fun being on a panel with so many of my heroes.
I know.
That's all I can say.
And please, let's continue the conversation offline at some point. I would love to talk more with you all.
Yeah.
That would be terrific. Thank you very much. Thank you, Michele, for thinking of me.
Thank you, Michele.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.